folks who were introverted in the room always would kind of be sort of shut down, David, like feeling, I'm something's wrong with me. And I kept getting that message over and over again. So that's sort of how I was led. I think I was really actually, somebody said a calling, I think I was led into this work. And because I started, when I started sharing and maybe giving some of the assessments and talking about introversion and extroversion, I got tremendous response. People were like, whoa, this is really explaining things. And I feel more relieved now.
Hello, and welcome to episode 219 of the Quiet and Strong podcast, especially for introverts. I'm your host, David Hall, and the creator of quietandstrong.com. This is a weekly podcast dedicated to understanding the strengths and needs of introverts, along with strategies for success. Introversion is not something to fix, but to be embraced. Normally, or each episode on a Monday morning, be sure to subscribe on your favorite platform, leave a review or a rating. That will mean a lot to me and also help others find the show. Tell a friend about the podcast and help get the word out there that introversion is a beautiful thing. Jennifer Kahnweiler is a best-selling author, podcast host, and one of the leading experts on introverts at work. Her pioneering books, The Introverted Leader, Quiet Influence, The Genius of Opposites, and Creating Introvert-Friendly Workplaces have been translated into 18 languages. The Introverted Leader was named one of the top 5 business books by the Shanghai Daily. Jennifer has partnered with leading organizations like NASA, Amazon, Merck, Kimberly-Clark, Bosch, and the U.S. Centers for Disease Control. She holds a certified speaking professional designation, awarded to a small percentage of speakers, and serves as a mentor to many professional women. Jennifer loves yoga, pickleball, making up stories with her granddaughters, and playing Jeopardy with her introverted husband, Bill. All right. Well, welcome to the Quiet and Strong podcast, Jennifer. Jennifer, it's so good to have you on today.
David, I always love to talk to quiet and strong people like yourself. Thank you for the work you do. It's incredible.
Yeah. And I've been following your work for quite some time. I started blogging in 2014. I was really probably embracing my own introversion, probably the prior 5 years before that. And one of the books I read was your Introverted Leader, which was really helpful to me. So thank you for that.
Oh, I appreciate that. I always love to hear from people that, found it helpful. So
Yeah,
thank you.
it's going into the 3rd edition, and we're going to get into that today. So I'm excited to talk more about that. But first, tell us a little bit about yourself and your journey as an extrovert to being an introvert champion and advocate. How did all this come about?
It's a typical and very insightful question. Where people always assume it's funny that I'm introverted, and I guess I have a little more acceptance now. People don't raise their eyebrows as much because we have a whole movement of David of allies now, for people that are misrepresented or misunderstood. And so that's cool. I consider myself an ally and always have. I started out in a very, I would say, mostly extroverted family, except for one family member. So I kind of thought that was the way the world was. And then time went on and I met my boyfriend, then to become husband, who was extremely introverted. I didn't have a word for that, but I knew that we kind of were at yin and yang, like a lot of, I guess, partners are. They somehow intuitively know they need that balance and, that calmness, that quiet. I met Bill and I would just ask questions and listen. And then I realized as we were moving into our relationship and then got married, that I was still a little perplexed about why he would kind of go off on his own a lot, after we were together or with people. I was like, is it me or what's going on here? And I was fortuitous because at that time I had been career-wise, been in a direction of counseling and working in the kind of the helping professions, if you will, in education, and worked in higher ed for a while and had a number of different iterations of that. I've always been sort of like looking for people to support in any way I can. That morphed into coaching and then leadership development. But at that point, I was introduced to the Myers-Briggs, which, back in, what was it, 70s, 80s, it wasn't really a very popular instrument. I mean, we know a little bit about it, but it was kind of like when I read that book by Daniel Goleman, Emotional Intelligence. It was like when I learned about personality types, I was like, whoa, this really puts into words or helps me understand, what's my confusion has been about. And so I use that tool all the time. And I learned as much as I could about it. And of course, I had my guinea pig at home, my husband, Bill, who I always laugh. At that time, he was actually listening to me. He was interested when I would come home, and he so identified with the descriptions that I would share with him. And I had him take the assessment too, in my learning journey with all this personality stuff, and he absolutely 100% identified as more introverted. And it explained for him a lot of the kind of disconnects he had felt growing up in a very extroverted environment with many expectations around being social and hanging out with people all the time. And he never wanted to do that. So he thought something was wrong. And I found that with a lot of my clients early on, that, I would do career coaching or training with them. And the folks who were introverted in the room always would kind of be sort of shut down, David, like feeling, something's wrong with me. And I kept getting that message over and over again. So that's sort of how I was led. I think I was really, actually, somebody said a calling, I think I was led into this work. And when I started sharing and maybe giving some of the assessments and talking about introversion and extroversion, I got tremendous response. People were like, whoa, this is really explaining things. And I feel more relieved now. And so that kind of snowballed into, larger stages and platforms where I would, work with many different, high level leaders, also people throughout organizations, trying to understand how to work better on teams, how to understand their managers better. My focus was, shifted to more the workplace. I guess it's always been there, but I was able to, use that knowledge. And I found people, as I said, very responsive. And I started to look for more tools, like you were mentioning. You read the book, and it's like, how can I help them apply some of this? And there really wasn't anything at that time that was, back in, when was it? Maybe around 2007, 2008, we didn't have much at all. So, when you want a book, they always say you can't find it, you should write it. That's how right. I started Introverted Leader. Yeah, that was the first one.
So a few different things on all of that. So you had Bill on your podcast, Introvert Ally. I loved it. And that's the kind of thing that's really powerful, is when you do the contrast, when you say, here's an introvert, here's an extrovert. Maybe you are married or in a relationship, or maybe you're work partners. I've had both contrasts on the show. And It's so powerful to say, hey, both are successful, both can get along, but you have to understand these differences. So it was very powerful when you had Bill on the show, with that contrast.
Well, yeah. I get that's usually the highest rated shows we do every season. And this year I was thinking of not doing it, but now you've convinced me. I better get him back on. He has to do some work on the podcast because he has to listen to all of them. But he doesn't mind doing that. So, and I was going to say that humor is really what also is important, don't you think, in those partnerships?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah.
And so early on, you're married. How did it take a while to develop that understanding of your different personalities?
Yeah, if people could see me now on video, you probably saw me raise my raise my eyes. Yeah, I think, the main word that I had to work on, and I think Bill did too, and is judgment. Because it's really ingrained in us that something is wrong. Like if somebody doesn't answer you back when you ask them a question, like, what the heck, And then when I'm going off, talking as extroverts do, we think aloud. So, and I'm needing him to listen, and he kind of can get overwhelmed. We're like, what is going on? So if you don't have that understanding, it's very tough. And it took a while. Yeah. And it's still hard sometimes. I mean, a lot of times talk about humor. He'll hold up one of my books and say, read the book.
And, what you said earlier is people think something's wrong with them. That was me. Sounds like that was your husband. So many of my guests that have come to embrace their introversion say the same thing. One nice thing is my wife is a fellow introvert, but she never felt like something was wrong. She always understood her strengths and her gifts, and she's been a very confident person her entire life. And so that was nice to see that contrast. Like, not everybody thinks something is wrong, but those that do, it's when you don't understand. Communication is a huge one that you were just mentioning. Like, all right, you're thinking out loud, putting everything together in my mind and sharing what's most important, what I think you think is going to be most important. And if you don't understand what's going on in each mind, there can be some conflicts and misunderstanding. And like you said, judgment, there can be some like, what's wrong with that person? Why are they like that? Or why am I feeling like this?
Well, you said a very interesting thing, your wife and I, about her being embracing her strengths. And I think that really has relevance for the way we raise children, the way we teach children today, because many of the people I met, even in their early 20s, already had discounted themselves. And they would get the results back on their assessments and go, oh, darn, I so wanted to be an extrovert, because part of it's misunderstanding. But I think if you have these messages ingrained in you in these various environments, that it's not cool to be quiet and to embrace silence, to recharge. If that is not accepted, that really is seen as something is wrong with you. So I'm really pleased that you had that possible role model, right? Or possible way to be. And I think if we can, whether we're extroverted or introverted, accept the young people in our lives.
Yeah. And that was another big epiphany for me. So my wife's introverted. We have 3 kids, 2 extroverts, 1 introvert. Raised them the same. These gifts just come naturally.
They really do. And you probably worked on it with your kids, explaining a little bit about, right?
Yeah, they know more than they want to, probably.
Oh, it's a funny thing about that. Bill and I came from the counseling background. One time we had one of those charts up on the wall, in dinner, we'd say, well, tell us how you feel, like point to the expression. Because we did have that in common. We wanted the kids to express themselves. And one night I came into the kitchen for dinner and the chart was nowhere to be found. They didn't want to deal with that. So you know what I mean? When you're really steeped in this stuff, the kids they really want nothing to do with it. But we get it to them in another way.
Yeah, it was cute though. When my daughter was little, my extroverted daughter, she would hear the conversations I was having, about my blog posts and podcasts later. And on her little chalkboard, she made a meme. It said, "Introverts are awesome." And it was just like she was listening.
Oh, that's so cool.
Yeah.
Really cool.
So when did you make the move from doing your work like in counseling and other things to being an author and a speaker on these topics?
Well, I think, as I mentioned, that it was so like a critical mass. Like I kept hearing, I'd be in a class, let's say teaching. I started to do more workshops with organizations. I was involved for a couple of years in outplacement for maybe a period of about a decade where, big career transitions in companies. So I really got to know people in those classes. And then I shifted into working more corporate. I worked at places like GE where I would be responsible for helping develop some change management leadership development programs. So we'd be back in those days, we'd be getting to know students, like spending 5 days with them at a retreat center. Gone are those days now, but we would really have a chance to help people understand themselves. That was a big part of those classes, like their strengths, their liabilities, how they can leverage those. And it was very powerful work. But I also found in those opportunities to work with people that they really did not engage as much as the people that were more extroverted, And so that kind of shifted. That's where I saw it's like, I need to kind of figure out some kind of a process or, to put this into a doable sort of model that people could follow. I was working a lot in technology at that time. And I don't know a lot about, I always laugh. I was very fascinated by IT people. The funny thing is they were very funny. Like they had great senses of humor and very creative, but they also know that they like to know, okay, so if I'm going to communicate with this person, what are some steps I need to take, Jennifer? So I started to think more in terms of the way they did with models. And I actually was pushed as I was writing my first book, which I did, I pitched to Barrett Kohler, which has been my partner for all of my books, to Steve Prasante, who is the CEO and the editor. And I was really fortunate. I mean, I say he changed my life because my manuscript fell on his desk, and he had like 1,000 proposals a year. But he was reading of it, and he said, I think I'm an introvert. He started to identify that. But he really pushed me to, when I was writing, to think in terms of a model. And that 4Ps model, which, you're probably familiar with, the prepare, presence, push, and practice, came from the words of introverts who told me this is how they succeeded. This is what they did. They used what their strengths were and applied that to different areas of emerging leadership on how they could be successful. And so he pushed me to do this. I was like, oh, really, Steve? I have to do this for the whole chapter. That turned out to be the best advice. That's why you have an editor.
Yeah, that's for sure.
They push you. And he said, this is going to make it doable. And, at that time, I was fortunate enough to come into this field at the very beginning, of where people it was getting into what I call the zeitgeist. I don't call it the German word, but, people were starting to understand it more outside of the coaching rooms, And Susan Cain, I was introduced to while she was writing her book, Quiet, which, as you know, became the linchpin in this whole movement. I mean, she just changed so many lives. But the nice thing was, I come from a very practical sort of standpoint, with like, take these steps. I've always been like that with all of my coaching and my work. And so we actually partnered together, and she shared my work. And I was really pleased about that, because people would get so interested and engaged and self-identify and process these ideas about the extrovert ideal. And it's like, hey, they would sit up in their chairs and be more confident. But then they wanted to know, okay, I go back into my workplace on Monday. How do I deal with my extroverted boss? Right. So then I started, that's what my book was helpful with. And then what would happen was I would, get feedback on the book, and the book really did get a lot of, it sold a lot of copies, which I was really happy about, of course. But the readers would then tell me what else they wanted to learn. So that's how we emerged in writing, 3 additional books after that.
Yeah, so we're going to talk more about your first book, but let's talk about the other 3. But I think they really summarize your work and the topics of that you address with introversion. So, your second one was Quiet Influence, correct? Tell us a little bit about that and your message of that book.
You're testing my memory here, but I'm
yeah.
happy to do it. I've got it right here by me.
Yes. Yeah, good.
It's called Quiet Influence, the Introvert's Guide to Making a Difference. And, when we think of leadership, it's a very broad term. We lead in all different ways, but many of the people and my clients and readers didn't really self-identify as leaders. They said, you know what, I need to get this project approved. I need to create change. I need to provoke new ideas and get people to hear them, in my organization. And a lot of that is around influencing without authority, right? So quiet influence is, how do you do it in a way that's not pushing your ideas forward, that's not the loudest voice in the room? And I knew I had been working with people my whole career who, and you'll hear this from a lot of people, the best influencers were the quieter ones. One example, you'd be in a meeting and everybody's blabbing away about, a change that's going to happen. Here's what we should do, blah, blah, blah. And all the extroverts are just like cackling geese, we used to say, right? And then you have the image of the great blue heron who swoops down, right? And kind of summarizes in a very articulate way what's been said, but then comes up with that idea that nails it. I'm snapping my fingers on the microphone. And so what was it that they were doing? So I did, and for all of my books, David, as you may know, I do research. And my research is is qualitative. So I talk to people and I do surveys, and we had a lot of responses to these questions around, how do you make a difference? And how are you successful doing that? So we found that it boiled down to 6 key strengths that introverts have that they use. Of course, they have tons of strengths, but and that was what we did. The way I structured the book was each chapter in Quiet Influence focuses on one of the strengths. For instance, one of the top ones was taking quiet time. So what do you do in that quiet time to kind of get yourself focused, to kind of figure out what your strategy is going to be? you know. Another one is, of course, listening, embracing listening, engage listening. So before people would necessarily push an idea or a project or a proposal, they spoke to a lot of different individuals beforehand. They did the research, the careful analytical thinking. They kept it moving. They had focused conversations trying to explain their point of view with their stakeholders, but then they would end up really with a rich proposal because they had talked with everybody. So all of these examples, I used a lot of case studies in there and tried to make it palatable. And I think kind of the cool thing about that book is also we looked at what happens when you overuse a strength, because it's not all great, right, with every strength. So for instance, if you're in silence too much, how is that a negative? How do people see you? Are you in your head too much so then you're never speaking up and you're trying to make that idea perfect? So it was just some caveats or warning signs. And I would say the same thing to extroverts. What are some strengths you have, but any overuse of a strength is a weakness.
Yeah, it's such a good example of the meeting. And extroverts generally think out loud,
Yep.
and introverts are processing and sharing what they think is most important. But everybody needs to understand that difference. And, as the introvert, you need to understand, hey, I've got something important to say. Your first P was preparation. That's so key. I got to prepare ahead of time, make sure that I make the point or ask the questions that I need to. But also people need to understand, hey, that person is going to need some time to process, hopefully ahead of time. But you need to have your self-awareness, but then people need to understand everybody else's personalities too.
Yes, absolutely. And that's not always, that's the ideal, isn't it? That's the ideal. But I'm sure I know you've had a lot of very successful introverts on your show. And one of the things that they've also talked about is how they've managed through that and by not trying to make let's say their input perfect. So like I remember Pat Waters, who you may be familiar with in HR. Did you have Pat on the show yet? I don't know.
No.
Okay, we need to get her on.
Okay.
Pat, I'm happy to make an intro
Yeah.
because Pat always shares golden information, and she actually has on her bio, "I am an introverted leader," which is so cool. But Pat talks about thinking things in her head maybe 2 or 3 times, and she's not going to keep it in there. She has to push herself. That's the push, to say it and not worry about what people think or if it's not perfectly formed, because perception is reality. If we're never sharing out loud in a group of extroverts, it's going to hurt us in
Yeah.
the end. So, but there are other strategies too for doing that, so you can be more comfortable. You mentioned the main one, which is preparation.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
All right. And then how about your next book, Genius of Opposites? Tell us about that
Yeah.
one.
Love the cover on that one. That was my
Yeah.
favorite cover
Yeah,
because
very cool.
anyone could see it's like it has genius of opposite, it's upside down. And this is really the idea that we're better together, like you said earlier on at the beginning of the podcast. If we can harness the energy of both of us, then it's exponentially better. So what we did there is look for, and I did deep interviews here, I remember, with a number of successful partnerships who are self-identified as introverts and extroverts in all kinds of fields, and ones that had sustained time, had been around for a while, and what they did and where they ran into roadblocks too, which is going to happen. So yeah, so we identified 5 different key themes again that they we pulled out of those interviews. One of them was we're kind of cute, tongue-in-cheek, accept the alien. Again, we talked about acceptance, right? Another was destroy the dislike. So what do we mean by that? It was like, you don't have to be best friends, but you do have to get along and have some sort of camaraderie. So what are you going to do to make that happen? And realizing that casting the character is another one, like making sure that you're always taking a look at how do you use those strengths with the end user. So my favorite example from that is my friend Marty, who's very extroverted as a salesperson, doing this presentation in the front of this room of healthcare folks he was selling to. And his partner was kind of moving around the periphery of the room, having very quiet kind of check-ins and conversations with those clients to see where the resistance was, what were they thinking. Together, they were extremely successful because they balanced their skills and their strengths. So I loved having like pulling out examples of that, the genius of opposites. And we have ones through history too, like Hall and Oates and all of these different people. And also ones that kind of blew up, when they didn't accept. It's not easy, like we said, with a relationship, with a marriage, same thing.
Yeah. And, there's so many different aspects of our personalities and we need them all, none of us have all the gifts. And sometimes we don't recognize that, we try to take a one size fits all approach, but really we need to value everybody's strengths and figure out how we can put that all together.
Oh, absolutely. And I think, again, I'll bring the humor in. That came up a lot. One of my favorite clips that I showed in the train, where I still show it in the training sessions, is with Gene Siskel and Roger Ebert, who were so different, and Ebert, as you can imagine, he was more, I'm not mixing him up. He was more extroverted. And they were like fire and water, but together they really, for people that weren't aware, they reviewed the movies when we used to just watch appointment TV.
Right.
Nights, they would go thumbs up or thumbs down. And when they disagreed, it was like very intriguing and engaging. And so there are some clips of them just cracking up, just kind of laughing and like throwing zingers at each other. But everybody can relate to that, not in a mean way, but just kind of like, you're my friend, but you're kind of so different than me,
Yeah, for sure. And then the next one, creating introverted friendly workplaces. And I was kind of interested in the fact that you put this out in 2020 and, all that happened in 2020.
Absolutely. And, it's really still absolutely relevant. I mean, not absolutely, but it's still relevant in many ways to what happened was I went out and did field research out in Silicon Valley and all of these places. And interestingly enough, it was very office focused. We had one section. What we did was take a look at a lot of the different practices within a workplace. So we looked here at the larger scale, of not just, if we think about introverted leaders, individual development, and then quiet influence was more influencing across, genius of opposites, introvert extrovert pairs. And then when we take a look at the structure, the workplace you're in, you want to have an organization that's going to embrace all types, right? Because if you're still working on the individual, but you still have a climate and a culture that is not supporting that, it's going to be very challenging, right? So it was really interesting to look at organizations, and it wasn't true in all aspects of their companies, but like in hiring, ones who were taking a step back and saying, are we being, let's discuss this. Are we being biased because we're expecting people to be like fantastic interviewers and have it all down in that way, but they're really competent and could do the job? I heard so many examples, and I have throughout my work, about people being passed over because they weren't scintillating, or they're not the person I want to have the beer with, So we looked at practices like that, like talent management. And then the workplace itself, the office environment. So that was interesting because we also addressed in this remote and hybrid, but of course then that exploded. And now we're kind of seeing somewhat of a shift as we record this episode. Who knows when it comes out, what's going to happen. We still have a tremendous amount of organizations sticking with the hybrid remote as of this recording. And I think that was the biggest part. If I can move into like what I worked on, the introverted leader now, which we took that even more forward to say, what were the results of introverts being at home, working from home? So that was a part of it.
Tell us about that. What are the results? What are the strengths? What are some myths about introverts working remotely? Tell us about that.
Yeah, we did this one survey I did. I had over 240 responses, and over 90% of the introverts were like thrilled that they had the option for remote. It was even a little bit less on hybrid. Now, we surveyed people at the beginning of the pandemic, and then this was after the book had just come out. I did one also before the book, and that was still seen as we didn't have the numbers then to assess remote work, but we still had a lot of anecdotal data that people loved it, because it wasn't as prevalent. It was becoming that way right before. And then of course it went full scale during COVID. But in any case, there was a couple of results that I think reflected even larger scale studies. One in particular by Nicholas Bloom, where he surveyed large amounts of people. And that was about having, first of all, something very basic. And this is true for introverts and extroverts, but I think the commute time, people, that was like the number one reason why people loved it. But then, of course, we found increased focus. Introverts like not having, do you have a minute? And then feeling that they were being rude, not talking to people. Flexibility was another key. And those were the key ones, I think. But at the same time, hybrid also is getting some positive marks, like in terms of having the face-to-face time, and having a chance to connect with your team members. I think what's happening now is, as I'm tracking what's going on, that we're getting more smarter about how the office time is used, because we would get a lot of feedback from introverts who were making a big effort to come in the office, then they'd be on Zoom calls all day. So that was not working. So
yeah, that sounds familiar.
Does that sound familiar?
Yeah.
You're doing that kind of thing. It's like, why am I here? Right? Why am I here? So I think that we are seeing that was just a really big shift in the workplace. And I think, it's been a very positive change for introverts to have that option, to be able to not have to have people facing days every single day, whether it's hybrid or remote. Now, you asked about challenges. Loneliness is the number one. They don't always say it that way, but that's what the research is showing as well, that, people can get isolated, just as we found with taking quiet time in quiet influence, that you can get very, just like in your head too much and not have stimulation. The research that's come out by my colleague and friend Ryan Jenkins, where he wrote a lot about loneliness, he distilled much of the research that talked about the endorphins going up when you simply even have a conversation with, somebody in a coffee shop or the barista, or in an elevator. Just seeing people is a very good thing. So, and that does not count really on Zoom.
Yeah. That's actually a lot. What you just described is where this podcast came from. So, it's 2020 and I'm hearing, oh, introverts are just loving this. But I knew some very lonely introverts, myself included. I was home with my family, which I love, my wife and 3 kids. I loved it. But I wasn't seeing anybody else. And you do, introverts, we all need connection. Sometimes we want it to look different than it does, but we all need connection, and just not seeing anybody, it was tough. And so I'm kind of a fan of the hybrid, because I do, there are some benefits from working from home, but personally, in the current work I'm doing, I don't want to do that all the time.
Yeah, of
because
course.
we need connection. It was interesting, a couple things. I missed the walking to a meeting or walking from a meeting with somebody and really making that connection. You didn't have that. It's like, okay, it's time for the Zoom meeting, time to stop, or you talked about the commute. While I don't miss the gas and the time and everything, that was a quiet time.
Yeah.
That I had to figure out, okay, where do I get this quiet unwinding time before work or after work?
Yeah, that you need to build that in. Exactly.
Yeah.
Just if you take it on the flip side, if people are focused or have all remote, they are finding ways to connect, like, intentionally schedule one-on-one conversations with the people that are not in their department, because that's what you're talking about. You're talking about like the cross-pollination, right?
Yeah.
That is helpful for your job, because then you get the context of what's happening outside of your just little area, right? But your Zoom meetings, a lot of those tend to be just with your intact teams. So I think that was one area that did come up in our surveys as being a concern, that I'm missing that. But I'm also seeing even companies sort of structure those times and say, this is your time to connect. We're pairing you with people. We started our book clubs back then because we were getting, with one company that we piloted with, Synchrony, they had gotten some results on there. They get very high results on that Great Place to Work survey, but they did get some concerns during COVID that people were feeling disconnected. So one of the very proactive leaders I work with, Josh Crawford, actually pulled his global team together on a book club. And they actually used our book, Creative Introvert.
Oh, that's awesome. That's awesome.
Every week they would do 2 chapters, and they would alternate who was facilitating, who was organizing. And it was a great way to meet people they would have really connected with. So, people are being, I think, people are being creative around that. I will say one other thing. When I did the original research for the workplaces, there's a company called Gensler that you might have heard with it. They're a design organization, and they've done a lot of research on what makes for a productive office environment. And they talked about 3 areas. One was collaboration. The second was socialization. And the third was belief focus. Okay. So that's where we were, if we think 2 out of 3 of those involve connections with people,
Yeah.
It's good to keep that in mind. And I have said, I just wrote a post about this in the LinkedIn newsletter that I do, which people can actually subscribe to. Just follow me on LinkedIn and you can sign up. But I talked about how now we have an opportunity, as we are having more companies, with these mandates to go back, to rethink how we address the needs of introverts. It's a good opportunity to do that. So yeah. I gave them some ideas. If they listen, it'll be another question.
All right. And then, of course, your first book, which is now in its 2nd edition, soon to be 3rd edition, The Introverted Leader.
Yeah.
We talk a lot about leadership on this podcast because there's still some misconceptions like, oh, introverts, they can't be leaders, So tell us, about an introverted leader, where it might look different for extroverts. What did you learn where you made a 2nd and now 3rd edition? What were the things that you learned about introverts and their path to success as leaders?
That's a great 2-part question there.
Yeah.
I think leaders of all types listen, David. We know that's a hallmark of a good leader, is to listen, to be thoughtful. And then being thoughtful, they're then decisive. Nobody wants a wishy-washy leader. They're clear in their communication. I think they engage with people very well. Good leaders, my best leaders that I've ever had have done that. And, they take the time to talk to people individually and get to know them. And I think that we saw that come out as a real strength over the last few years when people are isolated, how important that even connected to their mental health and their productivity. So I think if you think about the introvert leader lens on top of that, introverted leaders have all of the key strengths to really make that happen. They just need to put them into play. And the other part of your question, tell me that again. I was focused on.
That's great. What changed between your editions, and what's coming out in the next one?
Yeah, that's a good question. They don't like us to change everything because what's working you want to keep as well, right? So we changed, I think 20%, 25%, something like that. So, I think there's more acceptance now and understanding of introverted leaders. So I did a whole new chapter about the new workplace, and that really bumped up, and incorporated a lot of the research I was just talking about that people can consider as they design their own optimal work situations, but also as managers think about the kind of environments they want to make conducive for everybody. So I think that's been the main change. Let me think what else we put in there. Every chapter has been updated with new examples. I started the podcast a couple of years ago, and I incorporated some of the top leaders like Doug Kona and some others who have shared some very personal stories, but also give another slant to the whole introvert acceptance kind of thing. And we did a whole series with quiet men that I collaborated with Ed Frauenheim on. And some of those like intersections of men who are introverted, women who are introverted, we pulled out some of those key themes from that. And I think those people will find very interesting as they deepen their own understanding, for themselves. I'm just pleased. I'm sorry, go on.
Oh, and I was just saying I had Ed on the show. So that's great work that you did with Ed.
Yeah, we worked well together. We have a good time together. People like you, I'm so pleased at this point in time that we have really terrific voices like yours who are, amplifying the needs of introverts. But I will tell you, it's very interesting. I don't know if you've heard this, but some people are saying that it's shifted so much that they don't want to be extroverts. I
I'm
don't know.
not quite hearing that, but
I'm hearing that from my extroverted people I run into. When we talk about introversion, extrovert, they go, "Oh, I'm really not an extrovert." When clearly they are, but I'm really not. The ones who are absolutely we know are extroverted. But it's kind of ironic. It's kind of funny to just hear them say, "Well, it's cool to be introverted." So I think we have to be careful about these labels and how we interpret them. And I will say that now a spectrum is how I look at things. Things are, since I wrote the first book and now even in this third one now, it's much more evident that, we're all on a spectrum. We're all on a learning journey. And, my editor said to me on this last book, he said, Jennifer, I think you've become an introvert. I was like, no, I wouldn't say that, Steve. I forgot that. But I said, why do you say that? Well, you're prepared so well for meetings. You're listening so much better. I said, I've learned from my introverted colleagues. So I think we all can learn from each other.
oh yeah, I think, and you brought up something that I battle is sometimes people are so interested in the label, and it's like, okay, the label, all that does is help you understand yourself, help you understand other people. And Jennifer, you're always going to be an extrovert. You can learn how to use your strengths and gifts and needs and be the best that you can be. And I'm always going to be an introvert. That's not going to change. And so many people say, well, I can't be an introvert. I like people. I'm like, yeah, we all like people. It's just you learn what you want, what you need, but liking people doesn't make you an extrovert. It's really
That's
how you process things more often
that's
than
right.
not.
That's right. And people also, what other things do they tell us? Well, I'm an introvert at home and I'm an extrovert at work.
Yeah, right, right, right.
That could be that you put on that hat, but it's always concerning to me if you're just coming up with trying to be somebody who's not you and being out there and you're going to be exhausted. So, know yourself. That know thyself is the old expression. And when you talk about what's a leader, the best ones know themselves.
Yeah. One more leadership question for you. So, being a successful leader in your experience, have you found that it can look different for introverts versus extroverts?
Can it look different? Yeah, I think people will come across differently in how they present because they're different people and they have different personalities. I don't think we can always tell, though, if somebody is an introvert or an extrovert because we all develop along that spectrum and we adapt. So we have to be careful of, you know, stereotyping. I think you were saying that before, of judging folks and saying, oh, I have an extroverted boss, when in fact your boss may actually be introverted. And because she or he has learned many behaviors to do, it's more, I see it more on the introvert side. So that's why it's extremely important to have conversations with the people you work with to explain to them what qualities are very important to you. Like,
Yeah.
how important is it, for instance, even on a basic level, to write down your thoughts to me so I can consider them? That's
Yeah.
important to make all the difference in how you respond and how you work together. So we oftentimes don't talk about how we work together. So I'm kind of moving from your question, but I think that's an important one without, when you say, is there a difference? Sure, we can present differently, but we truly don't know somebody and what they need until we have a conversation with them.
Absolutely. And I know some very loud and outspoken introverts that people probably judge as extroverts, but you really have to get to know a person, their strengths, their needs, how they process information, all that good stuff.
Right. That's right. And they need to know themselves and share that
Yeah.
and say
Yeah.
what they need. And, it's interesting. I've had a lot of introverts who I've interviewed, you probably have as well, who say, it's up to me. If it's to be, it's up to me. I think Doug said that on the podcast. If it's to be, it's up to me. It's not just for us to guess what you need, right, from us. I need
Right.
we need to share that. And I have to sometimes nudge my introverted clients to speak up and say what you need.
Yeah.
So that way people can really be effective in working with you.
And then one last question. You were talking about how things have changed since especially since you started writing and speaking.
Wow.
Is there anything else you wanted to say about that? Like how our conversations and understanding of our personalities have changed over this time?
Well, I think it's mostly very positive that people are actually willing to discuss this and they passed, as my friend Sam Horn says, they passed the eyebrow test. When you still bring up this topic, people will raise their eyebrows, so you know they're interested. So I would say it's very interesting. Whereas you said before, you'd say introverted leader, they're like, what? How could that ever be? So I think we're seeing more of an understanding and interest in this topic. So I think that would be probably the main change that I've seen, and just so many people like yourself who have embraced this in their own lives and want to share the message, that we're going to have a better, more productive, happy, joyful, planet if we can bring out everybody as they are, and not we don't have to fit into a certain type of stereotype that we think is success. So I think we're broadening the meaning of success by all of these discussions and all of this understanding and awareness. And the research will continue. I hope it does.
Yeah, well said on all of that. So Jennifer, this has been a great conversation. You do some amazing work. Your third edition of the Introvert Leaders coming out. Your third season of the Introvert Ally podcast is coming out soon, correct?
Yep, next week, day before my birthday, March 25th.
Awesome.
I got my birthday in there. I love celebrating my birthday.
Yeah.
Yes, it's a way to do that, right? March 26th.
Awesome.
My family knows they're tired of hearing me talking about my birthdays. Yeah, next week we have that launching, and then the book comes out June 24th, and people can pre-order it now on Amazon. It'll be available on the other sites soon too, where you get your books.
Awesome.
And LinkedIn is another place that I engage a lot with people. So I'd love to connect with you there.
Sounds great. Thanks again, Jennifer. This has been a wonderful conversation. Thanks for all the work you do.
David, right back at you. Thank you.
Thank you so much for joining me. I appreciate you. I hope you take the time to explore other episodes and learn from other amazing guests. Remember, if you're interested in getting to know yourself better, there is now a free Type Finder personality assessment on the Quiet and Strong website. This free assessment will give you a brief report, including the 4-letter Myers-Briggs code. I'll add a link in the show notes. And I'd love to connect with you. Reach out at david@quietandstrong.com or check out the quietandstrong.com website, which includes blog posts and links to social media for Quiet and Strong and much more. Send me topics or guests you would like to see on the show. So many great things about being an introvert, and so we need those to be understood. Get to know your introverted strengths and needs and be strong.